One of the most common questions that we get is, are ministries allowed to remove disruptive people?
It's a great question, and many ministries will encounter this. Many churches will encounter this. The quick answer is yes, they can. They are private property holders in most cases, in which case they can remove anyone for any reason they deem logical.
When do you start to think about removing them?
Yeah, there's basically two types of disruptive individuals. One are those who come in to the building and they appear to be agitated and disruptive. The other type are those who kind of plant themselves inside the sanctuary and who plan to disrupt the service during a particular moment in time. And so those are the two types that we see. And depending on which type there is, it will dictate how we respond to that particular individual.
So when do you think is best for outside law enforcement to get involved?
Anytime there is a threat that physical harm could be done or physical contact will be needed to remove the individual from a particular space is when you would typically want to call police enforcement right away.
So to clarify then, you should not physically remove them.
If you can at all keep from doing that, yes. There could be instances when that's just necessary to keep the safety of those in your premises or on your premises. But generally, no, you should not try to touch the individual. Try to instead create a barrier, if you can, with your body and the bodies of others between the pulpit area or the sanctuary, depending on where you're at, and the individual. Sometimes just creating that physical barrier in front of the individual will keep things to a relative hum as opposed to what it could potentially become if you don't create that physical barrier.
What should ministries do beforehand to prepare for potential disruptive people?
And this is the key, right? So I've been to seminary. I know in seminary they don't teach you, hey, have a plan or policy in place for a disturber coming into your property. But this is definitely a needed thing. So the best thing you can do is prepare and have a policy in place, procedures in place, so that when this does happen, you're prepared, and your people are prepared, and your teams are prepared, and your ushers are prepared, and your greeters are prepared. But also your safety team. So if you have a safety team, it's important to inform that safety team that there could be those who come onto the property who want to disturb the service or just the entirety of the ministry itself. And you want to provide them with training, hopefully through a local law enforcement agency or somebody who's trained in that particular capacity, to provide that security team with training should a disturber come onto that property. Typically, security teams will be trained by law enforcement agencies or a private industry individual who has been in law enforcement and can train them on de-escalation techniques and other techniques that would not lead to a liability issue for the particular church or ministry.
Yeah, I bet that would make them a lot more sound by having outside training.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you develop a security team and you don't have that outside training done, the risk of liability rises, right? You could have somebody on that security team that would want to physically interact with this individual. Again, this is something we want to stay away from. If you can avoid physically encountering this individual and touching the individual, that's what you want to do as a first priority.
Yeah, train out those instincts.
And on that point, it's particularly important to train and secure individuals on your security team or as a greeter or as an usher who are calm individuals, who are not prone to anger and also are not prone to fear. So one thing that disturbers will try to look for is they'll try to look for somebody who has fear. And so if you can avoid showing fear to this individual, you can likely calm them down and move them to another location to have a conversation. Another thing that's important in this respect too is to remember what your ministry is. It's a ministry of Jesus Christ, and you're trying to reach lost people. This disturber may be a lost individual, and maybe having a bad day. There's one instance that I can recall where this individual was causing the disturbance in the foyer. One of our greeters came up and said, "Hey, it sounds like you're having a bad day." And at that moment, the guy just broke down in tears because he was having a bad day.
Yeah.
And he wanted somebody to listen and somebody to hear. And here this greeter was who could just recognize what was going on and say, "Hey, it looks like you're having a bad day. Let's go talk about this over in this private location." And that's all that it took.
That's great.
So I think it's important for ministries and churches, Christian churches, to remember, hey, these are lost people potentially. And even if they're not lost, these are people who we want to reach with the gospel.
Right.
Your first priority, obviously, is the safety of the individuals in your care. You have a duty of care to those individuals. But secondarily, to minister to that individual who may be having a bad day or may be in a different mindset that would not be conducive to his well-being or the well-being of others.
What about when there are demonstrators, which that would hopefully be very few and far between that we'd have demonstrators coming to a church or a college or a school. Is there a difference in that situation versus an individual?
Yeah, potentially. So I was a pastor out in Washington, D.C. for a decade. Church was on Capitol Hill. So we had protesters all the time outside of our building. They were outside of our building, and we allowed them to protest outside of our building as long as they didn't come inside the building and disrupt the service. So that's really up to the ministry whether or not they want to remove individuals from their premises. In which case, they can. You can offer those protesters to go across the street or to some other location where they can exert their First Amendment rights. But once they've stepped foot onto your premises as the church or the ministry, you have an ability to remove those particular individuals or ask that they leave the premises. In our case, we allowed them to protest outside as long as they didn't disturb what was going on inside the building. And we used that opportunity to encourage them to come inside the building without their signs and without their anger and listen to the gospel being preached. So that's another opportunity to potentially minister to these individuals as well.
It's good to go about it calmly and verbally as opposed to threats. Even though you feel threatened, that's not the way to go about it.
Yes. Yes. And oftentimes we would have situations where those individuals who would try to enter the premises were on drugs or were somehow inebriated in some particular manner. We couldn't have those great conversations with them because they couldn't understand what we were saying. They just weren't in the mental state to handle those situations. In those situations, you try to calm down the individual. You try to have those conversations. And if those fail and if they are still trying to physically enter the building, that's at the point at which you want to call law enforcement because they have the means to remove that individual in a way that doesn't cause liability for the church. Some churches I know are okay with those protests and see those as fine, in which case allow them to do so. I know in one particular case that I was involved in as a pastor is I tried to engage those individuals in a conversation, say, hey, let me understand more about what you're protesting. Let's see if we can come to some sort of agreement. How can I help you? How can you help us? Oftentimes we have an alignment in theology potentially that we could actually use as a basis to de-escalate this particular situation. And so I'm trying to minister to those individuals as long as they are not too vehemently against or opposed to what that conversation may entail.
That's great. I know many individuals that work in a ministry, and some of them have had problems in the past with homeless individuals coming onto their property, either asking for help or just hanging out. Um, in that case, I think it would be having the heart for ministry still. How do you balance that?
Having been the pastor in Capitol Hill, again, we had many homeless that were kind of walking the streets and oftentimes would find their way inside our building. We love that. We love that. Generally, what we would do is try to, when we see those individuals, we would recognize, okay, they may be homeless. How can we minister to them? We would typically try to assign either one of our ushers or deacons or greeters to that individual so that we can use that opportunity to evangelize. So we'd have that individual sit next to that individual while he's on the property or while she's on the property to make sure that we have safety for them and for those around, but also to be able to minister, answer any questions. Now, there are some situations in which the homeless would come in and they would be inebriated. In those situations, we would see that as potentially causing harm. So there may be an instance when that happens where you don't necessarily want to remove the individual, but you want to assign somebody, a chaperone of some sort, and potentially have that individual sitting in a location where they can hear or see the service, but not necessarily be around others that they could potentially harm in their inebriated state. So you really have to assess the situation and the safety of the situation. Just because they're homeless doesn't mean that they are necessarily unsafe. It's really the state of mind that they come in on, and we know obviously there's challenges in that population oftentimes as a result of their homelessness.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make sure that you're still ministering to those people and not just sending them away just because they're other from you.
Yes. So one cool story on this: when I was pastoring, I was kind of the guy in charge of handling any homeless person that came into the building. And in most cases, there was one guy in particular that came in an inebriated state. And so it would be a weekly ordeal for me is trying to deal with this individual, trying to help this individual, and try to help him get on the right path. Well, after several months of him coming every Sunday, in an inebriated state, he came one day in a less than inebriated state. And so he came ready to actually receive the word. So, hey, I said, hey, brother, why don't you come with me? And I want to sit with you. And he listened to the sermon. We had a 2-hour-long service. He listened to the sermon. He asked questions. He asked dynamic questions of what the gospel was about. Had this great interaction with him. He came back the next week with a Bible in hand. I don't know where he got the Bible. He came back with a Bible in hand. He came back every week after that, and eventually was baptized. And so just a really, really neat story that is a result of trying to minister to these individuals who may on the outside not look like individuals that we want inside the church, but those who God can still redeem.
Yeah, those are the people we're called to help. So how do you prioritize the safety of your attendees, congregants, while still caring for these potentially disruptive people?
Yes, it's a great question. Ministries need to understand anytime someone comes onto the property, they've got a duty of care for the safety of that individual, which means if there's a threat to the safety of those individuals, they need to understand that they've got a duty to protect in some reasonable manner those individuals from that threat. That may mean removing that threat from the premises. And now I know we want to minister to those potential individuals who are threats, but ministries need to understand that their first priority needs to be the safety of those in their care that are not threats. And so it could mean that, look, we remove this individual to another location of the church, of the ministry, where we have a conversation where they're no longer a threat to others. It may mean that we remove this individual from the property altogether and then have a conversation off the property so that they're not a threat to those on the property. It could mean a number of different things. And so though we want to try to minister to the individual that's causing the threat, if it is an imminent threat, ministries need to understand that they have a duty of care to protect those on their premises from that potential threat.
So what potential liability is there for being physical with someone that is a disruptive person? What concerns that should we have in mind instead of just going in full force?
Like I said, it's best not to touch anyone. It's best not to physically have to remove that individual. But in some cases, it may be required. So let's say that occurs. In that situation, if that individual who's causing the harm or causing the threat of harm is hurt, there is always the potential for a lawsuit to be filed against the church for his or her injuries. That is why it's so important to have insurance that covers those sorts of things. Many insurance companies like Brotherhood Mutual have a security operations coverage form that allows those churches to be covered in the event that a security personnel or otherwise other individuals would need to come in and to physically remove the individual or physically subdue the individual in the case of an imminent threat. And so insurance for this particular potential encounter is paramount. Because these things do happen, as we know. We see it on the news all the time. And so it's important to have that insurance in place.
Would you need to have something like that if you mostly have like other outside law enforcement coming in? Or you still have like greet teams and potentially a safety team, but their priority isn't security. It's more about, people don't trip when they come in, or, things are clear in the sanctuary.
Yeah. You have your general liability insurance that's going to cover most of those things typically. But as it regards forcibly removing a threat, that's where you want to have security operations coverage to make sure that is covered in case you do have to make a physical movement of some sort towards that individual to subdue or remove. What we also have is something called traumatic incident insurance or coverage that actually covers the church in case there are other church members who observe something traumatic that happens that causes them emotional damage as a result, an emotional injury. And so you could look into your insurance carrier, ask them, hey, do we have a traumatic encounter insurance of some sort that would help protect the church in the event that a traumatic incident would happen and somebody is traumatized as a result thereof?
Yeah, so cover counseling and other potential services needed.
That's right. Yes.
Okay. So what should ministries do if they have more legal questions?
Yeah, they should always feel free to reach out to local counsel. Local counsel in their state can give them specific guidance as it regards law enforcement rules and regulations and their own liability risks as a ministry or a church. You can also reach out to Brotherhood Mutual's Legal Assist ministry as well. This is a free complimentary service that we provide to any ministry. You don't have to be one of our policyholders. And we provide free risk management guidance. So you can write in with any questions that you have, and we will try to do our best to provide you good risk management guidance as well.
Great. Thanks for your time, Charles.
Thank you.